Take those flowers out of my building. The words sliced through the glass-walled conference room so sharply that even the investors near the back table stopped whispering. Vivian Ashford didn't raise her voice often. She didn't need to. Power had a way of making silence obey. The 43rd floor of Ashford Luxury Group overlooked downtown Chicago like a kingdom built from steel and cold ambition. Rain streaked softly across the floor-to-ceiling windows while expensive shoes crossed polished marble beneath white recessed lights that hummed faintly overhead. At the center of it all stood Vivian Ashford herself, composed and untouchable in a charcoal gray suit, her dark blonde hair tied neatly behind her head, one hand resting against the conference table as executives waited for her next decision like nervous students before a final exam. Then the elevator doors opened again. Ethan Cole stepped out quietly carrying a bouquet of white lilies wrapped in brown paper. His delivery jacket was damp from the rain outside. Water clung to the sleeves near his wrists, and his tired work boots squeaked softly against the marble floor as every eye in the lobby turned toward him. He looked completely out of place among the tailored suits and glowing digital displays. One investor smirked under his breath. Another assistant glanced down at the name stitched onto Ethan's faded jacket before quickly looking away again. Vivian barely spared him a glance. "We're in the middle of a board meeting," she said coldly. "Leave the flowers with reception." Ethan adjusted the bouquet carefully in his hands, protecting it from bending. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he replied gently. "The little girl who sent these asked me to make sure you got them personally." A few people exchanged amused looks. Someone near the coffee station chuckled quietly. Vivian's expression hardened instantly. "I don't accept personal deliveries." Ethan nodded once, respectful, calm. "I understand." He started to step back. Then he paused. "But she really hoped you'd read the card first." The room shifted slightly after that. Not dramatically, just enough for curiosity to replace irritation. Vivian exhaled slowly through her nose, already exhausted from negotiations, stock projections, and a morning filled with men asking her to smile more while discussing billion-dollar acquisitions. "Who sent them?" she asked flatly. Ethan hesitated. "Her name's Lily." Vivian frowned faintly. "I don't know any Lily." Ethan lowered his eyes for a second. "She saw your picture in a magazine at the grocery store." This time several executives laughed openly. One of them muttered, "That's a new marketing strategy." Ethan heard it. He simply pretended he didn't. Quiet dignity settled over him like rain over pavement. No anger, no shame, just patience. He extended the bouquet slightly forward. She used her own allowance to buy the card. Vivian stared at the lilies. White, simple, the exact kind she hated most. Something tightened behind her expression for only a fraction of a second before the steel returned. "I said no." Ethan slowly nodded again. "Then I'll leave." He turned carefully toward the elevator, trying not to crush the flowers in his arms. But just as the doors began to close behind him, a small white envelope slipped loose from inside the bouquet and drifted onto the polished marble floor. Nobody moved at first. Then Vivian's eyes caught the uneven handwriting across the front of the card. The room suddenly felt quieter than before, quiet enough to hear the rain tapping softly against the glass high above the city. The card stayed untouched on the marble floor for almost 3 full seconds. In a building where every second was measured in profit margins and stock movement, that kind of silence felt enormous. Vivian Ashford stared at the crooked handwriting on the envelope while the rain continued whispering against the windows above Chicago. Then finally, without saying a word, she stepped forward in her black heels and picked it up herself. Ethan had already disappeared behind the closing elevator doors. One of the executives gave an awkward laugh. Probably another charity thing. Vivian did not answer. Her thumb brushed lightly across the edge of the envelope, as if she were afraid touching it too quickly might disturb something fragile inside. Then she slid the small card free. The handwriting was uneven, clearly done by a child. Tiny flowers were drawn along the corners in purple crayon. Vivian's eyes narrowed slightly as she read the first line. Meanwhile, nearly 12 miles away on the south side of the city, Ethan Cole pushed open the door to a narrow second-floor apartment above a laundromat that smelled faintly of detergent and old heat pipes. The hallway lights flickered weakly overhead as he stepped inside, carrying the now half-empty flower wrap beneath his arm. "Daddy," a small voice called instantly from the kitchen table. Lily Cole sat surrounded by crayons, construction paper, and an open library book about wildflowers from the Midwest. Her long blonde hair was tied into a loose ponytail that had almost completely fallen apart. The moment she saw Ethan return without the bouquet, her face lit up with cautious hope. Did she get them? Ethan set his keys down gently beside the sink. She did. Lily straightened in her chair, so quickly her crayons rolled onto the floor. Did she read the card? Ethan hesitated for only a second before giving her a soft smile. I think she is about to. Lily pressed both hands against her chest like she had been holding her breath all afternoon. Outside their apartment window, the wind rattled softly against the old fire escape, while traffic hummed below in long, tired waves. The apartment itself was small enough that Ethan could stand in the kitchen and still hear the ancient refrigerator clicking beside Lily's bedroom door. But despite the peeling paint and worn carpet, warmth lived there. Drawings covered the refrigerator. School papers were clipped carefully to the walls. A small vase holding 2 supermarket daisies sat beside the sink like something sacred. Lily lowered her voice slightly. Do you still think she looks sad? Ethan loosened his damp jacket and hung it carefully near the door. Sometimes people who have everything still carry heavy things inside. Lily nodded seriously as if that made perfect sense to her. Children often understood loneliness faster than adults did. She glanced down at the flower book again. White lilies mean remembering people, she said quietly. Ethan froze. For the smallest moment before looking toward her. Where did you read that? In the library book. She traced her finger gently over one of the pages. And when I saw her picture in the magazine, she looked like somebody who forgot how to smile for real. Ethan looked away toward the darkening kitchen window. Downtown skyscrapers glowed faintly in the distance beyond the rain clouds. He thought about Vivian Ashford standing in that polished tower with cold eyes and perfect posture. He thought about how quickly people in expensive suits had laughed at a little girl's kindness. But mostly, he thought about the moment the card touched her hands. Lily hopped down from her chair and walked over carrying another folded piece of paper. I made one more drawing, she said softly. Ethan accepted it carefully. Crayon flowers stretched across the page beneath uneven block letters written in purple. For people who feel alone. Ethan swallowed hard before smiling down at her. Then somewhere far across the city, inside a silent glass conference room overlooking the rain, Vivian Ashford slowly read the final line written inside Lily's card. And for the first time in years, her expression began to change. My mommy said flowers still talk after people are gone. Vivian Ashford read the sentence twice before the words truly reached her. The conference room around her faded into a distant blur of expensive watches, glowing presentation screens, and nervous executives pretending not to stare. For a moment, all she could hear was the soft hum of rain against the glass and the faint ringing silence that follows a memory too painful to stay buried. Her fingers tightened slightly around the card. The white lilies rested motionless on the marble table beside her like ghosts from another lifetime. Across the room, one of the board members cleared his throat carefully. Ms. Ashford, should we continue with the merger projections? Vivian did not answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the childish purple crayon flowers drawn around the edge of the card. Uneven little petals. Crooked stems. The kind made by tiny hands trying very hard to create something beautiful. Slowly she lowered herself into her chair. Nobody in the room spoke after that. They all knew Vivian Ashford as the woman who built an empire before turning 35. The woman whose interviews appeared in financial magazines beside headlines calling her ruthless, brilliant, untouchable. They knew her as the CEO who slept 4 hours a night and once fired a senior executive for mocking a janitor in the lobby. But almost nobody knew the version of Vivian that existed before the glass towers and magazine covers. Before silence became armor. Before grief became discipline. 12 years earlier, the scent of hospital antiseptic and white lilies had filled a dim recovery room on the north side of Chicago while snow drifted quietly outside the windows. Vivian had been 23 then. Young, hopeful, in love with a man who promised forever and disappeared the moment life became complicated. She remembered sitting alone beneath fluorescent lights with trembling hands resting against a hospital blanket that suddenly felt unbearably empty. Nurses moved quietly around her, while sympathy flowers arrived one after another from people who did not know what to say. White lilies. Always white lilies. She had hated them ever since. Vivian blinked hard, and returned to the present. Her assistant Claire stood carefully near the doorway now, uncertain whether to interrupt. "Should I remove the flowers?" she asked softly. Vivian looked toward the bouquet again. The petals were still damp from the rain Ethan had carried them through. Something about that detail unsettled her more than it should have. Nobody protected flowers in Chicago rain unless they mattered. "No," Vivian said quietly. The room seemed surprised simply because her voice sounded human again. She reached for the card once more and read the final line beneath Lily's message. "Sometimes lonely people forget they deserve beautiful things too." Vivian lowered the card slowly into her lap. Her throat tightened before she could stop it. Across the polished conference table, investors shifted awkwardly in their seats, suddenly uncomfortable inside the cold atmosphere they once admired. One woman, near the end of the table quietly, removed her glasses and looked away. The silence in the room no longer belonged to power. It belonged to something gentler, something sadder. Vivian stood abruptly and walked toward the window overlooking the rain-soaked skyline. 43 floors below, tiny headlights drifted through the wet streets like rivers of light. Somewhere down there was a little girl who spent her allowance trying to comfort a stranger she had never met. And somewhere beside that little girl was a tired single father who carried flowers through the storm without asking for anything in return. Vivian closed her eyes briefly. Then for the first time in years, the woman who controlled billion-dollar decisions pressed a trembling hand against her chest and whispered something almost too quiet to hear. "Who are you people?" The lilies remained on Vivian Ashford's desk long after everyone else had gone home. Outside her office windows, downtown Chicago shimmered beneath rain and reflected headlights, while thunder rolled softly somewhere beyond the lake. The massive headquarters of Ashford Luxury Group had finally gone quiet for the night. No clicking heels, no ringing phones, no assistants rushing through glass hallways carrying schedules worth millions of dollars. Just silence. Vivian sat alone beneath the dim amber glow of her desk lamp, staring at the child's card again. The edges were already slightly bent from how many times she had unfolded it. Beside her rested a silver-framed photograph turned face down against the desk. She had not looked at that picture in nearly 3 years. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Vivian reached toward it and turned it upright again. The photograph showed a younger version of herself standing beside a hospital window wearing a pale blue sweater, one hand resting against a small curve beneath her coat. Her smile in the picture looked uncertain but hopeful, like someone trying to believe life would finally be gentle. A man stood beside her with one arm around her shoulders, though his face had long since become meaningless to her. Vivian stared only at herself, or perhaps at the future she never got to meet. Her chest tightened again. She looked away quickly and stood from her chair. Across the office, the lilies caught her attention once more. White petals, clean, fragile, beautiful in a way grief often was. She walked toward them slowly. "You always hated flowers after that day." The voice startled her softly. Claire stood near the office doorway holding a tablet against her chest. Vivian had not even heard her enter. Claire immediately looked apologetic. "I am sorry. I did not mean to scare you." Vivian composed herself instantly, rebuilding the familiar walls around her expression. "You are still here?" Claire nodded. "I was finishing tomorrow's investor schedule." Her eyes drifted carefully toward the bouquet. "I have worked for you 6 years, Vivian. You have never kept flowers in your office before." Vivian remained silent for a moment. Then finally she asked the question that had been quietly following her all evening. "Did we get any information about the delivery man?" Claire glanced down at the tablet. Reception found the delivery receipt. "His name is Ethan Cole. Independent courier work. Part-time florist deliveries." Vivian lowered her eyes slightly. "And the girl?" Claire softened immediately. "Lily Cole, 8 years old." The office grew quiet again after that. Claire hesitated before speaking carefully. "Do you want me to send a thank you arrangement?" Vivian almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Flowers in return for flowers. Transaction replacing sincerity. "No," she said quietly. "That would ruin it." Claire studied her boss carefully then. Not as a CEO, not as the most intimidating woman in the building, just as a lonely human being trying very hard not to fall apart in front of someone else. "That little girl reached you somehow," Claire whispered gently. Vivian turned toward the rain-streaked windows again. "I do not understand why." Claire's voice remained soft. Maybe because children say things adults are too afraid to say honestly anymore. Vivian closed her eyes briefly. Somewhere in her memory, she could still hear hospital monitors humming faintly through cold hallways. Still smell antiseptic. Still feel white lilies arriving beside sympathy cards she never wanted to read. But this card was different. There was no pity in it. No obligation. Just kindness from a child who noticed sadness in a stranger's eyes. Vivian opened her eyes again slowly. "Find their address," she said at last. Claire blinked slightly. "Tonight." Vivian nodded once. "I think I owe them something more important than flowers." Then she reached down carefully, lifted the bouquet into her arms for the first time, and held it against her chest while rain whispered against the glass above the sleeping city. By the following evening, the rain had finally stopped over Chicago, leaving the streets slick beneath the glow of yellow traffic lights and storefront reflections. Vivian Ashford sat alone in the back seat of a Blacktown car moving quietly through neighborhoods most executives in her world never entered unless a camera followed them there. Outside the window, laundromats flickered beside old diners, grocery stores glowed beneath buzzing neon signs, and tired families hurried through the cold carrying paper bags filled with dinner and tomorrow's worries. Claire sat beside Vivian holding a printed address in her lap. "We can still turn around if you want," she said gently. Vivian kept her eyes on the passing streets. "I do not know why I am nervous." Claire gave the smallest smile. "Because this is probably the first thing you have done in years that was not planned by lawyers or shareholders." Vivian did not answer. The car slowed near an aging brick building with a rusted fire escape running along its side. One hallway light blinked weakly near the entrance. No valet, no polished glass doors, no security team waiting to greet her. Just ordinary life. The driver stepped out first to open the door, but Vivian was already reaching for the handle herself. Cool evening air brushed against her face as she stepped onto the sidewalk, holding the bouquet of white lilies carefully against her coat. Claire remained near the car while Vivian approached the building alone. The stairwell smelled faintly of detergent and old wood polish. Somewhere upstairs, a television played softly through thin apartment walls while a child laughed in the distance. Vivian climbed slowly in heels not designed for places like this. Then she stopped outside apartment 2B. Warm light glowed beneath the door. She could hear quiet movement inside. A pan clinking softly, small footsteps crossing the floor, and then a man's tired but gentle voice. "Careful, sweetheart. The soup is still hot." Vivian froze for a moment with her hand hovering near the door. Something about the ordinary tenderness of that sentence unsettled her more deeply than boardrooms ever had. Slowly, she knocked. Inside, footsteps paused. A second later, the door opened, and Ethan Cole stared at her in complete surprise. He wore a plain gray sweater with the sleeves pushed up slightly, revealing flour dust across one wrist. Behind him, the tiny apartment glowed with warm yellow kitchen light. Lily sat cross-legged at the table coloring on the back of a cereal box while a pot simmered softly on the stove. For a moment, nobody spoke. Ethan looked genuinely confused to see one of the most recognizable women in Chicago standing outside his apartment, carrying flowers he had once delivered to her. "Ms. Ashford." Vivian suddenly felt strangely unsure of herself. "I hope this is not inappropriate." Ethan blinked once before stepping aside politely. "No, ma'am. Of course not." Vivian entered slowly. The apartment was small, but alive in ways her penthouse never seemed to be. Children's drawings covered the refrigerator with magnets that did not match. A pair of tiny sneakers rested near the couch beside library books and folded laundry. The air smelled like tomato soup, garlic bread, and something softer she could not name at first. "Home." Lily looked up from the kitchen table and nearly dropped her crayon. "Daddy," she whispered loudly. "That is the sad lady." Ethan looked embarrassed immediately. "Lily." But Vivian surprised them both by laughing softly. Not the practiced polite laugh she used at charity galas. A real one. Small and startled, like she had forgotten how it sounded. Lily's eyes widened instantly. "You smiled," she said. Vivian looked at the little girl quietly for a moment. Then she glanced around the tiny apartment once more before speaking almost to herself. "I think maybe I needed someone to remind me how." The soup simmered softly on the stove while snow-like steam curled into the warm kitchen air, fogging the edges of the apartment window overlooking the glowing Chicago streets below. Vivian Ashford sat carefully at Ethan Cole's tiny kitchen table, holding a chipped ceramic mug between both hands, as though she was still uncertain she belonged there. Across from her, Lily colored quietly with intense concentration, occasionally glancing up at Vivian, as if making sure the smile she had seen earlier was real and had not disappeared again. Ethan moved around the kitchen with quiet efficiency, placing bowls onto the table, folding dish towels, checking the bread in the oven. There was nothing impressive about the apartment by the standards of Vivian's world. The cabinets were slightly worn. The kitchen floor creaked near the refrigerator. One of the dining chairs had clearly been repaired more than once. And yet something inside the room felt steadier than the polished penthouse she returned to every night. "You really cooked all this yourself?" Vivian asked softly. Ethan glanced over his shoulder with a faint smile. "Most nights." Lily immediately lifted her hand proudly. "Daddy makes the best grilled cheese in Illinois." Ethan laughed quietly beneath his breath. "That is a very specific award." Lily shrugged seriously. "I stand by it." Vivian found herself smiling again before she could stop it. The sound of ordinary conversation wrapped around her gently, unfamiliar in its simplicity. Nobody here wanted contracts from her. Nobody monitored her expression, waiting for approval. Nobody cared about stock prices or magazine covers. Ethan set a bowl of soup carefully in front of her. "It is just tomato basil," he said. "Nothing fancy." Vivian looked down at the steam rising from the bowl. "I think I am tired of fancy." The room softened after that. Ethan finally sat down across from her, while Lily continued drawing flowers on scrap paper beside them. For a few moments, only the clinking of spoons and the distant rumble of traffic filled the apartment. Then Vivian noticed a framed photograph resting quietly on a nearby bookshelf. A woman with warm brown hair stood smiling beside Ethan while holding a much younger Lily wrapped in a pink blanket. Vivian's eyes lingered there carefully. Ethan noticed immediately. His expression shifted, not with pain exactly, but with the quiet ache of someone who had learned how to carry grief gently instead of fighting it. "My wife," he said softly. "Her name was Hannah." Vivian lowered her spoon slowly. "She looks kind." Ethan nodded once. "She was." Lily looked up from her coloring. "Mommy loved flowers too." The apartment grew quieter after that. Ethan glanced toward his daughter with soft patience. "Especially Lily's," Lily added. Vivian's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the bowl. Ethan noticed the reaction immediately. "I am sorry," he said quietly. Lily did not know. Vivian shook her head slowly. "No, it is all right." But her eyes remained fixed on the photograph. Hannah's smile felt strangely familiar somehow. Not visually, emotionally. Like someone Vivian had crossed paths with long ago during a version of herself she barely recognized anymore. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. "Lily saw your picture in a grocery store magazine aisle last week." Vivian blinked toward him and decided I looked sad. Ethan smiled faintly. "Children notice things adults miss." Lily nodded enthusiastically. "You look like somebody pretending to be okay." Vivian stared at the little girl for a long moment after that. No investor had ever spoken to her that honestly. No board member ever would. The kitchen light reflected softly across Lily's crayons scattered beside the table, while Ethan quietly folded napkins nearby, giving the conversation room to breathe. Then Vivian finally asked the question resting heavily inside her chest since the moment she read that card. "Why would you teach your daughter to care about strangers this much?" Ethan looked toward Lily before answering. "Because one day the world is going to tell her kindness is weakness." His voice stayed calm, steady, and I want her to know that it is not. Vivian lowered her eyes slowly after that. Somewhere deep beneath the armor she had spent years building, something fragile and forgotten began quietly breaking open. The evening stretched longer than any of them expected. Outside the apartment windows, the city softened beneath misty streetlights, while passing cars hissed quietly across wet pavement below. Inside apartment 2B, warmth settled gently into every corner like something alive. Lily eventually fell asleep sideways on the couch beneath a faded yellow blanket. One crayon still loosely resting in her fingers beside half-finished flower drawings scattered across the cushions. Ethan carefully adjusted the blanket over her shoulders before lowering the television volume even further. Vivian watched him silently from the kitchen table. There was something almost sacred about the way he moved around his daughter. Quiet, attentive, never rushed. like love itself had become part of his routine. Ethan returned to the table, holding 2 mugs of tea this time instead of soup. Chamomile, he said softly. It is all I have. Vivian accepted the mug with both hands. It is perfect. The apartment lights were dim now except for the small lamp glowing beside the bookshelf. Shadows stretched softly across the walls lined with children's drawings and framed family photographs. Vivian's eyes drifted once more toward the picture of Hannah. This time she stood and walked closer to it. Ethan remained seated, sensing something shifting inside her. Vivian picked up the frame carefully. Hannah's smile felt strangely familiar again. Not just emotionally now, visually. Something about her eyes. The softness in her expression. Vivian's brow furrowed slightly. What did your wife do? She asked quietly. Ethan looked toward the photograph. She was a nurse. Vivian's fingers tightened slightly against the frame. Where? St. Catherine Memorial. The room suddenly felt still. Vivian slowly looked up at him. Downtown. Ethan nodded once. Maternity and recovery wing mostly. The tea in Vivian's hands trembled faintly before she set the mug back onto the table. Somewhere deep inside her memory, fluorescent hospital lights flickered awake again. Snow falling beyond dark windows. A young nurse kneeling beside her bed speaking gently when she could barely breathe through the grief. Vivian swallowed hard. What was her full name? Ethan's expression shifted slightly now too, sensing the change in her voice. Hannah Cole. Silence. Real silence. The kind that settles so deeply into a room it almost has weight. Vivian stared at the photograph again, and suddenly she remembered. The nurse with warm brown eyes who stayed late after her shift ended because she noticed a young woman crying alone beside a hospital window. The nurse who quietly removed sympathy flowers from the room after hearing Vivian whisper she hated them. The nurse who brought coffee no one asked for and sat beside her without forcing conversation. Hannah. Vivian lowered herself slowly back into the chair. I knew her, she whispered. Ethan blinked in surprise. What? Vivian's eyes never left the photograph. Years ago. Her voice sounded distant now, fragile around the edges. After I lost my baby. Ethan stared at her quietly across the table while realization slowly unfolded between them. Vivian let out a trembling breath. Your wife sat with me for almost an hour one night because I could not stop crying. Ethan's face softened immediately. That sounds like Hannah. Vivian nodded faintly. I never forgot her kindness. Her eyes glistened beneath the dim apartment light now. But I never knew her name. Ethan leaned back slowly, stunned by the strange tenderness of fate weaving itself silently through years of separate pain. Then his eyes moved toward Lily asleep on the couch. That explains something, he said softly. Vivian looked at him carefully. What? Ethan smiled sadly. Before Hannah passed away, she used to talk about a woman from the hospital. Vivian's breathing slowed. Ethan continued quietly. She said there was this young woman sitting beside a snowy window who looked completely alone in the world. Vivian covered her mouth gently with trembling fingers. Ethan's voice lowered even further. Hannah said she hoped that woman eventually learned how to smile again. For several seconds Vivian could not speak at all. The city hummed quietly outside while the little apartment remained wrapped in golden light and memory. Then finally, with tears standing silently in her eyes, Vivian Ashford looked toward the sleeping child on the couch and whispered the words she had not said aloud in over a decade. Your wife remembered me. The clock on Ethan Cole's stove blinked 11:42 p.m. in soft green numbers while the city outside slowly settled into midnight silence. Lily remained asleep beneath her blanket on the couch, one hand curled gently around a purple crayon like she had fallen asleep mid-dream. The apartment lights were low now, casting warm amber shadows across the kitchen walls while steam from untouched tea drifted quietly upward between Ethan and Vivian Ashford. Neither of them seemed ready for the evening to end. Some moments in life arrive so unexpectedly that leaving them too soon feels almost cruel. Vivian sat very still at the kitchen table with Hannah's framed photograph resting carefully in her hands. Her thumbs traced softly along the edges of the frame while old memories unfolded one by one behind her eyes. I used to think nobody saw me back then, she admitted quietly. Not really. Ethan listened without interrupting. Vivian gave a faint, almost embarrassed smile. I was young, angry, heartbroken. I thought money would eventually make the emptiness quieter. She glanced around the tiny apartment filled with warmth, drawings, dishes drying beside the sink, and a sleeping child who still believed flowers could heal sadness. It did not. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment before answering softly. Grief does not care how rich you are. The words settled gently between them because both of them knew they were true. Vivian looked back toward Hannah's picture again. Your wife sat beside me for almost an hour one night during a snowstorm, she whispered. She barely spoke. She just stayed. Ethan smiled sadly. That sounds exactly like her. Vivian's eyes glistened under the soft kitchen light. I remember asking her once how she stayed kind after seeing so much sadness every day. Ethan leaned forward slightly, almost afraid of the answer before she even spoke it. Vivian looked toward him then. She said kindness is easiest when you remember everybody is carrying something invisible. Ethan closed his eyes. Briefly after hearing that, a quiet breath escaped him, somewhere between heartbreak and gratitude. She used to say things like that all the time, he murmured. The apartment fell silent again except for the distant hum of traffic outside and the old refrigerator clicking softly near the hallway. Then Ethan stood slowly and walked toward a small cabinet near the bookshelf. From inside, he removed an old wooden box worn smooth at the corners from years of careful handling. He carried it back to the table and placed it gently in front of Vivian. There is something else, he said quietly. Vivian looked uncertain as he opened the box. Inside rested old photographs, folded notes, hospital bracelets, and sympathy cards tied together with pale ribbon. Ethan carefully unfolded one yellowed piece of paper from the bottom. Hannah wrote this a few months before she passed away. Vivian accepted the note carefully. The handwriting was soft and slanted, unmistakably feminine. Her breath caught almost immediately as she read the first sentence. There was a young woman at the hospital today who looked like she had forgotten she deserved kindness too. Vivian's fingers trembled. Ethan watched her silently while she continued reading. I do not know her name, but I keep thinking about her. Some people hide loneliness so well the world mistakes it for strength. A tear slipped quietly down Vivian's cheek before she could stop it. Ethan's voice remained gentle. Hannah talked about you more than once after that winter. Vivian looked up slowly, stunned. Ethan smiled faintly through his own sadness. She said she hoped life eventually gave you a second chance at happiness. For several long seconds Vivian could not speak at all. She pressed the letter carefully against her chest while emotion moved silently across her face like rain breaking through stone. Then finally, almost in disbelief, she whispered the question resting at the center of her heart. After all these years, how did your daughter find me? Ethan looked toward Lily asleep beneath the blanket before answering softly. Maybe kindness remembers people even when we forget ourselves. 3 weeks later, the lobby of Ashford Luxury Group no longer looked the same. Morning sunlight streamed through the towering glass walls, spilling gold across polished marble floors where executives hurried toward elevators with coffee cups and glowing phones in their hands. But now, at the center of the vast lobby where cold silence once ruled everything, stood something unexpected. A garden. Not extravagant. Not corporate. Just simple white lilies arranged beneath warm hanging lights surrounded by wooden benches and quiet greenery that softened the steel and glass around it. Employees slowed when they passed now. Some sat there during lunch breaks. Others simply stopped for a moment before continuing through the rush of another business day. Above the flowers rested a small bronze plaque. For the people still learning how to breathe again. Nobody knew who wrote the words except Vivian Ashford herself. She stood near the balcony above the lobby watching people move below, while soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers overhead. Claire stepped beside her holding a tablet against her chest. The board members still think the flower garden is an unusual financial decision, she whispered with amusement. Vivian smiled faintly. Then perhaps it is the first good decision they have questioned in years. Down below, the revolving front doors opened slowly, letting in a swirl of cool autumn air from the Chicago streets outside. Ethan Cole stepped inside wearing his old brown jacket with Lily beside him, holding a tiny bouquet of fresh lilies tied together with purple ribbon. The little girl stopped immediately when she saw the garden. Her eyes widened so dramatically that even the security guards near the front desk smiled. "Daddy," she whispered breathlessly. "It is beautiful." Ethan looked around the transformed lobby quietly, almost overwhelmed by the softness, now living inside a place that once felt cold enough to echo. Employees noticed them immediately. Some recognized Ethan as the delivery man from weeks earlier. But this time no one laughed. No one whispered. People simply watched with quiet respect as Vivian Ashford herself descended the staircase toward them. Her heels clicked softly against the marble while the entire lobby gradually slowed around her. Ethan straightened slightly, unsure what to say. Vivian stopped in front of Lily first. "I think these belong here," Lily said shyly, offering the bouquet forward with both hands. Vivian accepted them carefully like something precious. "Thank you," she whispered. Lily tilted her head. "You smile more now." A few nearby employees lowered their eyes after hearing that. Because it was true. Vivian looked toward Ethan then. For a moment, neither of them spoke. So much had changed in only a few weeks that words suddenly felt too small for it. Finally, Ethan glanced around the lobby garden. "You did all this because of a card from a little girl?" Vivian shook her head slowly. "No." Her eyes softened as they met his. "I did this because your family reminded me that grief does not have to be the end of kindness." Silence settled gently across the lobby after that. Not uncomfortable silence. Not empty silence. The kind that appears when people suddenly realize they are witnessing something honest. Claire quietly wiped her eyes near the reception desk. Even several executives standing by the elevators looked strangely humbled. Vivian glanced toward the lilies resting in her hands before speaking one last time. "Your wife changed my life once," she said softly to Ethan. "I think maybe she just finished the job through both of you." Ethan lowered his eyes for a second, emotion passing quietly across his face. Then Lily stepped forward unexpectedly and wrapped her small arms around Vivian's waist. The powerful CEO froze completely in surprise, but only for a heartbeat. Slowly, carefully, like someone afraid of breaking a miracle, Vivian wrapped her arms around the little girl too. Around them, the giant lobby of Ashford Luxury Group fell completely silent beneath the morning light. And somewhere beyond the towering glass windows overlooking Chicago, life moved on in all its noise and hurry, while three wounded hearts stood quietly together beside a garden of white lilies, finally learning how to breathe again.